Welcome to the deep dive. Have you ever wondered how long it actually takes to turn just a ordinary tax-paying, family-loving person into an active participant in a violent mob?
Most of us really want to think the answer is, never.
Right, yeah. We picture these horrific acts of violence as the exclusive domain of, I don't know, sociopaths and villains.
Mm-hmm.
But science suggests the timeline for turning a totally normal person into a monster might be less than 6 days.
Which completely shatters that really comforting illusion we all have that perpetrators of extreme violence are just born that way. I mean, it is so much easier to believe in a binary world where you are either a fundamentally good person or you are an inherent monster.
Yeah, exactly. But the moment you step into the world of behavioral biology and sociology, that neat little dividing line just totally vanishes. And that is exactly what we're unpacking today.
Boy, absolutely.
We're looking at a deeply thought-provoking 2023 op-ed published in Neuroscientist. It's titled The Banality of Our Evil, and it's written by J.P. Linstroth, who is a former Fulbright scholar with a Ph.D. from Oxford. The mission for today isn't just to, talk about bad behavior.
No, it's much deeper than that.
Right. It's to move entirely past that old few bad apples argument and look at the actual literal mechanics of social conformity.
And, it's really important to note right up front that Linstroth anchors his theory in some highly charged recent tragedies, specifically the deaths of Tyre Nichols and George Floyd in the United States.
Yeah.
But he's not doing this to make a political argument. He is using these cases to isolate a strictly behavioral question, which is what happens to human psychology when a uniform goes on?
And just to be super clear for you listening, we are not taking sides or debating the politics of policing here. That's not what this is. Our focus today is strictly on impartially unpacking the behavioral science and the sociological theories from the source material. We're just looking at the mechanics of human behavior.
Exactly. We're just looking at the science.
Right. And Linstroth sets a really fascinating baseline by pointing out a specific detail in the Tyre Nichols case that kind of complicates the standard narrative of systemic violence.
Yeah, he focuses on the fact that the 5 police officers from the Memphis Police Department who beat Nichols to death were, themselves, African American.
Right.
For Linstroth, this is the crucial data point that forces us to look past a framework of purely racial targeting. I mean, if you remove that variable, you are left staring directly at what he calls the mindlessness of the institutions themselves.
Wow.
He is asking how violence becomes so normalized within a rigid structure that your individual identity is completely overwritten by your group identity.
And to answer that, the text reaches back to one of the most famous and honestly probably most misunderstood philosophical concepts of the 20th century, which is Hannah Arendt's phrase, the banality of evil.
Yeah, that's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, and usually incorrectly.
Oh, totally.
She coined it in her 1963 report, Eichmann in Jerusalem. People hear the word banality and they assume it means the evil itself is boring or that the acts are somehow ordinary.
But she was looking at Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust. And there's absolutely nothing ordinary about the Holocaust.
Of course not.
What she saw wasn't some mustache-twirling villain reveling in bloodlust. She saw a middle management bureaucrat.
Right.
She defined the banality of evil as mindless violence done within an institution, fundamentally rooted in an absolute inability to think from the standpoint of somebody else. It's just a total failure of empathy, replaced entirely by an obsession with administrative rules, quotas and institutional role.
And the thing is, this is not an isolated historical anomaly. The text draws parallels to other horrific events to demonstrate how this specific type of mindless institutional violence replicates itself globally.
Yeah,
Well, you see it in the Hutu soldiers participating in the Rwandan genocide. You see it in Guatemalan soldiers conducting murderous campaigns against indigenous peoples, or Pol Pot's forces laying landmines in Cambodia.
Jeez.
In all these cases, individuals are committing atrocities not out of deep-seated personal malice, but because they are functioning as synchronized cogs in a larger violent machine.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because there is a massive complication to Arendt's theory that Linstroth addresses. And it frankly feels like a fatal flaw to me.
Oh, the documentary.
Yes. In 2022, a documentary came out called The Devil's Confession, The Lost Eichmann Tapes. These were newly discovered audio recordings of Eichmann, and they completely upend Arendt's original observation.
They really do.
In these tapes, Eichmann wasn't acting like a mindless, unthinking paper pusher. He fully confessed to his direct involvement, and worse, he admitted to perversely enjoying his role in the final solution. So, I mean, if the absolute poster child for the banality of evil actually enjoyed the evil, doesn't that destroy the entire premise?
Well, you would definitely think so. It certainly proves Arendt misjudged Eichmann, the man. But what's fascinating here is how Linstroth defends the core of the theory.
How does he do that?
He concedes that Eichmann was clearly, truly a sociopath. But the mechanism of institutional evil that Arendt identified remains absolutely accurate, even if she applied it to the wrong guy.
Oh, I see. So the machine still works exactly the way she described it. It just happens to be a machine that allows a sociopath like Eichmann to thrive.
Precisely. And more importantly, that same machine forces the ordinary person to comply. The phenomenon of the ordinary person becoming heinous still exists.
Right.
When an individual becomes fully institutionalized, the most horrific acts become routine because the perpetrators literally stop critically examining their actions. They outsource their morality to the institution.
Wow. They outsource their morality.
Yeah. The banality lies in the thoughtlessness of the involvement. They stop asking, is this right? And start asking, am I following the procedure?
Which brings us to a really uncomfortable realization. If this type of group violence isn't just a gathering of evil masterminds, but a process of ordinary people conforming to a system, there has to be a physical mechanism driving it.
Exactly.
Because we aren't just abstract minds floating in space, we are biological creatures. There must be a neurochemical mechanism making that conformity happen.
And this is where we dive into the biology of us versus them. Because to understand why people kill for an institution, you first have to understand a fundamental biological truth, which is that humans generally do not want to kill at all.
Right. The text cites David Grossman's book On Killing, which is just a fascinating read.
Oh, it really is.
Grossman points out that humans possess a profound innate aversion to killing each other. Looking at military history, he found that even in the absolute heat of battle, a surprising number of soldiers will actively avoid firing their weapons directly at the enemy.
Yeah, they'll shoot over their heads.
Exactly, or they'll pretend to fire. We are fundamentally wired to resist taking human life.
Which presents a massive logistical hurdle for any bellicose institution, right?
Yeah.
Whether that's a military or a specialized police unit. If your recruits are biologically wired to avoid violence, how do you train them to actually commit it?
Right.
Linstroth brings in the work of neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky, specifically his book Behave, to explain how institutions hack our biology to overcome this aversion.
What does Sapolsky say?
He argues that when soldiers do shoot to kill, they aren't usually doing it out of a deep hatred for the enemy, nor are they doing it out of blind obedience to a commander's orders.
They do it out of what Sapolsky calls pseudo-kinship.
Yes. They do it to protect their band of brothers. They shoot so they don't let the guy standing to their left or their right down. The institution strips away the individual's outside identity and artificially creates a family unit.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the biology behind this pseudo-kinship is just wild. Sapolsky breaks down the actual mechanics of shicking and theming.
It's fascinating.
The moment we form an us, our brains start inflating our own merits. We convince ourselves that our morals are superior, our culture is better, our gods are the right ones. But the flip side of that cognitive bias is how we view them. We immediately start viewing the outgroup as threatening, unpredictable, and fundamentally untrustworthy.
And this isn't just a psychological trick we play on ourselves either. It is a potent neurochemical feedback loop happening in real time in your brain.
Right.
The source points directly to the hormone oxytocin.
Yes. And we usually think of oxytocin as the cuddle hormone, right? Like it's the chemical that builds the bond between a mother and her newborn or between romantic partners. It is the warm, fuzzy neurochemical of human connection and love.
Exactly.
But in an institutional setting, it acts like a toxic team-building exercise.
That is the perfect way to describe it. Our biological desire to be a good teammate is fueled by oxytocin, and it is exactly what enhances that us versus them divide. It strengthens the in-group bond so intensely that it actually overrides our natural aversion to violence, allowing us to commit atrocities against the opposing team. It literally weaponizes our desire to belong.
And Linstroth pairs that oxytocin effect with another biological mechanism, which is the insular cortex in the brain.
Oh, this part is wild.
Yeah. Now, the insular cortex is heavily involved in processing physical disgust. It's the part of your brain that lights up when you smell rotten meat or taste sour milk. It tells you to get away from the pathogen. But Sapolsky notes that this exact same part of the brain can create literal, physical, social disgust toward outsiders.
Right, it acts as a biological firewall. So you have oxytocin making you violently protective of your in-group, just flooding your system with feelings of loyalty and love for your team.
Okay.
And then simultaneously, your insular cortex is making you physically, viscerally repulsed by the other group, treating them like a literal pathogen.
When you realize that our brains are wired with this dual mechanism, it makes you wonder how fast a toxic culture can hijack our behavior. I mean, if the neurochemistry is already sitting there just waiting to be triggered, how quickly can an institution flip the switch?
Well, the data suggests it happens alarmingly fast. And we don't just have to guess at the timeline either.
No.
Linstroth points to one of the most infamous real-world psychological experiments ever conducted to prove just how rapidly this biological and psychological wiring can be manipulated.
We all know Zimbardo's 1971 Stanford prison experiment. We know the setup: healthy, normal university students randomly assigned to be guards or prisoners in a mock prison in a basement.
Yep.
But the specific data point that Linstroth isolates here, the one we usually just gloss over in Psychology 101, is the timeline.
Exactly. The experiment was fully scheduled, funded, and designed to last for 2 weeks. But the conditions inside that fictional prison deteriorated so rapidly and so violently that Zimbardo was forced to shut the entire thing down after just 6 days.
I mean, think about the last time you started a new job. How long did it take you just to adjust to the new environment? To figure out where the break room is, or learn your coworkers' names? It usually takes weeks to feel fully integrated.
Oh, at least.
Yet it took less than 6 days for ordinary, healthy college students to transform into despotic, malicious abusers simply because an institution told them that was their role.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the environment completely overwrote their individual personalities in less than a week. The guards became wildly sadistic, enforcing arbitrary rules and psychological torture, while the prisoners became deeply traumatized and submissive.
It's so disturbing.
It perfectly illustrates the cognitive dissonance of mindless violence.
It's terrifying. They didn't have to be brainwashed for years. They just put on a uniform, formed an us, and the neurochemistry did the rest.
Which connects back to a Latin proverb Linstroth cites in the text, homo homini lupus est. A man is a wolf to another man. The Stanford prison experiment proves that extreme institutional violence is not about individual inherent morality. It is about the crushing power of the immediate social environment to instigate and perpetuate violence. When the environment demands conformity, the biological imperative to belong will almost always win out over abstract personal ethics.
Which honestly leads to an incredibly bleak logical question. If we are biologically wired with oxytocin to prioritize pseudo-kinship, and we possess an insular cortex that physically repulses us from outsiders, and we are psychologically wired to conform to violent institutional roles in under a week, are humans just doomed? Is group violence an inescapable feature of our genome?
It's the most important question to ask, and it is exactly where Linstroth turns to evolutionary biology for a broader perspective. Because the answer is no, we are not doomed. Violence is a capacity, but it is not a certainty.
He looks at our evolutionary split from the primate family tree, right?
Yes. Scientists suggest that human ancestors split from the chimpanzee line about 7 to 8 million years ago. Now, non-bonobo chimpanzees exhibit what evolutionary biologists call proto-warfare.
Proto-warfare.
Yeah, they conduct highly organized, violent territorial patrolling for land and resources. They form an us, they patrol the borders, and they brutalize them. It looks remarkably similar to human warfare.
Which, on the surface, would suggest that tribal violence is baked deeply into our DNA.
Right.
But then the text brings up the bonobos.
Right. Bonobos are another subspecies of chimpanzee, and they share almost the exact same genetic percentage with humans as the violent chimps do. Yet bonobos are remarkably peaceful.
Really?
Yeah, they don't engage in proto-warfare. They resolve conflicts through social bonding, grooming, and sexual contact rather than violence.
So the genetic closeness of the peaceful bonobo proves that human violence is not preordained. We have the biological hardware for intense violent tribalism, but we also have the exact same hardware for peaceful, empathetic social resolution.
Exactly. We are not slaves to the oxytocin insular cortex loop. We have the cognitive ability to override it.
But how does that actually play out in the real world? It's one thing to say a bonobo is peaceful in the jungle, but it is entirely another to ask a human being to break the spell of intense oxytocin-fueled social conformity when literally everyone around them is engaging in institutional evil. How does an individual actually break that mechanism?
To answer that, Linstroth brings up what might be the ultimate modern example of institutional evil, and simultaneously the ultimate example of a human being breaking the cycle. He takes us to the Vietnam War, specifically the My Lai Massacre in 1968.
This is one of the most devastating historical events of the 20th century. U.S. soldiers entered a village and carried out a systematic massacre against unarmed Vietnamese civilians. The source notes that between 350 to 500 unarmed people, including infants and the elderly, were mutilated and killed.
It's horrific.
It was the absolute darkest manifestation of group conformity. These soldiers acted in conjunction with one another to commit unimaginable violence against people who posed zero actual threat. The insular cortex was treating those villagers as a pathogen, and the oxytocin was keeping the soldiers loyal to each other's violence.
It is the banality of evil in its most visceral, horrifying form. The institution's objective completely erased the humanity of the victims. But, and this is key, the massacre was halted. And it wasn't halted by an order from a general miles away. It was halted by individuals on the ground who refused to conform.
Right. U.S. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, Jr., a helicopter pilot, along with his two crewmen, Andreotta and Lawrence Colburn, they were flying a scout helicopter over the village.
What Thompson did is structurally staggering when you look at it through the lens of behavioral biology.
Yeah.
He saw what his fellow Americans were doing on the ground. He landed his helicopter directly between the fleeing Vietnamese villagers and the advancing American soldiers. He oriented his machine guns toward his own fellow troops. And he gave his crew a direct order. If the American soldiers attempt to further harm these villagers, you shoot them.
I want to really sit with the psychology of that moment, because we just spent the last 10 minutes talking about how overwhelmingly powerful the urge to protect the in-group is. We talked about pseudo-kinship and oxytocin and the biological drive to protect your band of brothers, which is drilled into every soldier from day one of boot camp. So how on earth did Hugh Thompson manage to instantly, in a fraction of a second, completely override that biology? How did he redefine his in-group to include the unarmed villagers and classify his own fellow soldiers as the them?
It requires a massive cognitive override. Thompson experienced a moment of hyper-awareness where he realized the institution had completely failed. In that moment of cognitive dissonance, instead of defaulting to the oxytocin loop of protect my uniform, he zoomed out. He expanded his definition of us to mean humanity.
He maintained his empathy.
Exactly. He maintained his ability to think from the standpoint of somebody else, which is the exact psychological mechanism that Hannah Arendt said was missing in Adolf Eichmann.
Right.
Thompson looked at the villagers, recognized their shared humanity, and his personal ethics overrode his biological pseudo-kinship with his fellow soldiers. Thompson's actions didn't just save the people right in front of him. Many villagers were subsequently airlifted out, and his intervention ultimately led to further U.S. military search and destroy missions being halted.
He literally broke the machine.
He broke the machine. And that is Linstroth's ultimate point in this entire piece. Social conformity is a staggeringly powerful biological and sociological force. It can lead to the Holocaust. It can lead to the reign of terror during the French Revolution. It can lead to modern-day institutional brutality. But it is not inevitable. We do not have to succumb to the mob.
Because knowledge of the mechanism gives us power over it.
Precisely. When you understand how an institution tries to hack your brain, when you recognize the toxic team building of oxytocin and the artificial disgust of the insular cortex, you can consciously choose to resist it. You can choose to redefine your us.
What a journey this has been today. We started with the incredibly heavy, real-world tragedies of Tyre Nichols and George Floyd, asking how ordinary people within institutions can commit such acts. We explored Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, the idea that thoughtlessness and a lack of empathy drive systemic violence, even if individuals like Eichmann revel in it.
Yeah.
We dug into the neurochemistry, looking at how oxytocin and pseudo-kinship trick our brains into violently protecting our in-group against a perceived out-group. We saw how terrifyingly fast that can happen in the 6-day collapse of the Stanford prison experiment. But we ended with the bonobos and with Hugh Thompson, Jr., proving that our biology does not dictate our destiny. By understanding the institutionalization of violence, we actually gain the power to overcome it.
It reminds us that critical thinking isn't just an intellectual exercise. It is a moral imperative.
Which leaves me with a final thought for you to mull over today. We spent a lot of time talking about oxytocin, the cuddle hormone, and how our deep, beautiful desire for connection, loyalty, and pseudo-kinship is the exact mechanism that institutions exploit to create mindless violence against an outgroup.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword.
It really is. So think about your own life. Does that mean our everyday efforts to build tight-knit, fiercely loyal communities, whether that's trying to build a strong culture at your workplace, in your neighborhood, or in your social circles, carry a hidden risk? How do you build a fiercely loyal us without accidentally laying the neurochemical groundwork for them?
That is the ultimate tightrope we all have to walk.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we'll see you next time.